Hello and welcome to the first episode of a series which will be going through every single issue of the official UK PlayStation magazine. We'll be taking a look at what journalists thought of the games back then and whether or not gaming culture has changed as a whole. And with this first episode, of course, we will be taking a look at the very first issue of the PlayStation magazine. So this issue was released in November of 1995 and it followed the huge PlayStation launch in the US, where Sony sold over 100,000 units of the PlayStation 1 in the first 2 days of launch. And the first big feature of this magazine is something that kind of covers the history of Sony entering the video game market and promotional strategies and things that they're planning for the UK release. Sony spent around £20 million on marketing in the UK in the period leading up to Christmas.
Here we have a normal, healthy young man. And here we have a fellow who's been experimenting with PlayStation for only a few minutes.
Early PlayStation games apparently had a problem with letterboxing, which was due to the amount of lines produced by certain TVs in different regions. Also, the size of the controllers had to be increased from the Japanese version, due to the average European's hand size apparently being bigger than the average Japanese person's. On the next page you can see some concept art of what the console and controller might have looked like. It seems that early concept art for consoles is always pretty terrible looking. I mean, how are you meant to use that controller right there? That would have been so uncomfortable to hold. Though the magazine goes into quite a bit of depth on the making and pre-production of the PlayStation, there is of course no mention of the partnership that was meant to occur between Nintendo and Sony that was discovered to have been the case years later. Ken Kutaragi, one of the main engineers on the original PlayStation, was quoted saying, "Our objective was a high-performance, low-price video game system which was easy to write games for. We wanted to get many software companies creating games, and so we had to design a very small and very sophisticated operating system and develop software libraries to help programmers. This enabled programmers to create games quickly and easily, and also allow them to write high-quality games in a short period. Those three things were the most difficult to get right." The magazine states that the reason the PlayStation could be so cheap, with its nearest rival £100 more expensive, is that the bulk of the chip development was handled in-house. Here's a Japanese column which reports on quite a few games, many of which never even made it to the UK, as the magazine speculates. One that had already been announced to be coming west, however, is also covered. One of the biggest to watch out for is Capcom's Biohazard, a horror-adventure polygon game and one of many due over the coming months. Biohazard takes a theme of a bacterial disaster, a topic which was made very popular among the Japanese following the cracking Dustin Hoffman movie Outbreak. A special tactics and rescue service team are sent into a sleeping Midwestern town to investigate a series of grisly murders. It is promptly attacked by massive killer dogs with a taste for blood and an apparent disregard for bullets. You control one of two agents and the game has two different plot lines depending on who you choose. The graphics look well tasty, and hopes are high for something of a renaissance in Capcom's ailing fortunes. One thing to note about these magazines, and in fact journalism in general back then, is the writing style was a lot different than what you see nowadays. There's no skirting around issues or being politically incorrect. The editor, in fact, states at the beginning of the magazine that it's just a fact that UK-based game companies are the best in the world. And also there's a lot of stuff that could now be considered culturally insensitive, such as this little section that says Fo-Fi from Battle Arena Toshinden could have been separated at birth from Pat Morita, who's Mr. Miyagi in The Karate Kid. But what it comes down to is that these magazines were written more like how you would speak to a friend in a pub or something like that, and it makes it a lot more enjoyable a read than a lot of politically charged journalism nowadays. Here's another great piece on Core Design's upcoming games, one of which called Tomb Raiders. Derby-based Core Design is currently working on a stunning 3D action adventure, which is allegedly unique in its approach. You can view the action from a number of different atmospheric camera angles, thanks to the incorporation of an intelligent camera system. The views switch according to your polygon character's position within the level. It also features a game I've never even heard of called Swagman, which is a top-down action puzzler, apparently taking influence from Tim Burton. With these two games being slated for release around the same time, the huge success of Tomb Raider probably overshadowed Swagman a bit. Here's a little bit on the advent of flat-screen TVs. The new LCD technology, dubbed Plasmatron, involves using hundreds of tiny tubes filled with plasma, a low-pressure gas ionised by several hundred volts, to activate the individual LCD crystals. With the release of the PlayStation, 3D fighting games started to really take off on console, and both Tekken and Battle Arena Toshinden were some of the more popular games on the console. The magazine says the visual allure of the 3D beat-em-up is likely to attract a whole new type of gamer because it feels so much more physical than its 2D counterparts. Tekken looks stunning, crafted with 3D polygon graphics and backed by flat parallax backgrounds. Having played both Tekken and Tekken 2 recently though, I have to say that fighting games have come on quite a bit since then. Early Tekken and Battle Arena Toshinden, which are similar games really, both feel very sluggish and slow to play, whereas early Street Fighter games haven't really aged that much. Some say it's fixed, some say it's crap, but some say that the World Wrestling Federation is the most exciting sporting pastime since, sex. This is covering one of the earlier WrestleMania games, as I think the most well-known one is probably SmackDown on the PS1. But this one features 2D graphics and has an art style more akin to Capcom's beat-em-ups. It was originally in arcades but was then converted for the PS1. The main feature in this issue is a focused look at the developers coming out of Britain, which makes sense as this is the official UK PlayStation magazine. Here's what it says. Britain has long been the source of the most talented coders in the business, reinventing jaded old game styles, or more often generating new ones. You may not have heard of aging classics like Elite, The Sentinel, Lords of Midnight, Populous, Exile, Lemmings, Sensible Soccer and Syndicate, but they have served to mark Britain as a reliable source of inventive, innovative and ingenious software. We've travelled the length and breadth of this fair isle unearthing the truth in a bid to bring you the definitive list of UK source games. Games like Crazy Ivan and Assault Rigs from Sony Interactive Studios, Actua Soccer, Loaded and Actua Golf from Gremlin Interactive, Theme Park, Syndicate Wars, Magic Carpet and High Octane from Bullfrog, who had recently been bought out by Giants Electronic Arts for $50 million. Core design responsible for the original Tomb Raider had Blam, Machine Head, Thunderhawk 2 and Shellshock, and of course, Worms from Team 17. Unfortunately, my next page has a bit cut out of it because of a competition on the other side, but this is another feature called the Lexicon of Gaming Terminology, going through and explaining technical terms in the video game world. A bit is a term used for data manipulated by electronic transistor circuits. A bit exists as one of two states, 1 on or 0 off, and it is these changing states that perform mathematical calculations. A byte is a collection of bits, like 011010001. In a system like the PlayStation, each byte is 8 bits long. Gouraud shading is a method of colouring polygons so that the intensity of the hue increases across the face of the polygon. I guess that would be a decent way of saving space to texture a polygon without actually using textures. The Internet is a global communications network of networks, also known as the Net. Many millions of computers are all connected together over the phone lines, allowing net surfers to access billions of megabytes of information about almost every subject known to man, primarily Star Trek and porn, although the latter is a good deal harder to download than the former. NTSC is the National Television Standards Committee, the TV standard used in the US and Japan. Unlike the UK PAL system, it displays 525 line picture at 30 frames per second. PAL stands for Phase Alternate Line. The UK TV standard, PAL has 625 horizontal lines and runs at 25 frames per second. So basically here in the UK we had a more cinematic frame rate built straight into the TV. Next up is the reviews section, which is called Playtest, which actually makes it sound like they haven't played it that much. But yeah, these are full reviews. Wipeout, which gets an 8 out of 10, is described as a gravity-defying, stomach-churning, futuristic racing game. A little more in-your-face passion would have been welcome, but it's still enormous fun. Battle Arena Toshinden also gets an 8 out of 10. They give the graphics a 9 and the gameplay an 8. A handsome 3D weapon-wielding, rib-bruising, projectile-hurling, butt-kicking beat-em-up. An ideal introduction to the underworld of the polygon combat game. Destruction Derby gets a 7 out of 10. The graphics got a 9, but the gameplay got a 7. One of the glaring faults was said to be that you aren't told when you're going the wrong way, either by announcement or an arrow on the screen. There's a very interesting review of XCOM Enemy Unknown that describes PC magazines as snorry. Perhaps there's been a mix-up and a review from one of those snorry PC magazines has somehow slipped into PSM. Despite that, this reviewer gave it an 8 out of 10 and said that it was largely the same as the PC version, but with some improved sound. Around this time there was no bigger racing game than Ridge Racer, and this launch title gets a 9 out of 10 from PSM. The main complaint at the time though was that this arcade conversion was single player despite the original being multiplayer. By this time though, Namco had already announced Ridge Racer Revolution, which rectified that issue, though the multiplayer did require 2 PlayStations hooked up with a link cable to play it. Here's a review of a game that people nowadays will probably refer to as a cute-em-up. It's Rapid Reload. This is of course a Japanese side-scrolling shooter, but surprisingly the reviewer found the game to be far too easy, which is not something that people usually look for in their side-scrolling shooters, it has to be said, so they gave it a 5. So Lemmings is actually one of the first games I ever played, and when I heard that there was a Lemmings 3D, similarly to when I heard there was a Worms 3D, I was actually quite baffled even at such a young age, and my immediate thoughts were that just sounds like it wouldn't work at all. And though Lemmings 3D is pretty much a game lost to time right now, I would say, this reviewer actually gave it an 8 out of 10. Love it or hate it, Lemmings 3D is addictive and extremely playable. Not a showcase PlayStation game, but a nice alternative to the norm. Discworld, despite having its gameplay described as alarmingly confusing, which I would certainly agree with, it is one of those games where you'll be wandering around wondering what the hell you're meant to be doing. It gets a 7 out of 10. Here's a surprising one, the original Rayman gets a 7 out of 10. The reviewer describes the gameplay as clumsy and confusing. Perhaps the most irritating aspect of Rayman is severe lack of speed. Instead of bounding around like a hyperactive 4-year-old child, this laboriously waddles like a heavily pregnant woman. Fluid and smooth in its scrolling, Rayman can't be faulted in this department. It's just a shame that you can't whack a turbo onto Rayman's backside to give him some more oomph. 7 isn't a bad score to be sure, but when you compare it to some of the other reviews in this section, and how Rayman has become such a well-loved franchise, I don't think describing it as clumsy and slow is that fair, to be honest. When compared with the now painful original Tekken, which was pretty much being touted as revolutionising fighting games a few pages ago. Theme Park by Bullfrog gets an 8, and I'm surprised that's not higher, judging by the many claims in this issue that UK developers are the best. And that's it for the reviews. Next up is a section where people have written in with feedback and comments. We can see that the debate about review scores was raging on even back then. Jay Soames from Hull writes, "Surely it's time for a rethink on the ridiculously outdated scoring system used in video game magazines. For years it seems that an average game has been receiving upwards of 70%. I mean, half the time the reviewer will say that a game is distinctly average, then mark it at 73%. I'd have been bloody pleased to have got such an average mark in my exams. So come on, how about a 50% score for an average game? Is it the industry hiding behind the scores, or are the reviewers too scared to put themselves on the line? I think we should be told." The funniest and perhaps dumbest letter is from Brad Esley in Leeds. So the PlayStation has finally been released in the UK. But isn't it just possible that we're seeing the best software for the machine in the first months of its existence? Games like the admittedly gorgeous Ridge Racer have been in progress for some 2 years because companies like Namco can afford to spend time on them. How many other companies will go to such lengths to produce top quality games when no one knows where the market will be in 2 years' time? And isn't it also the case that games like Ridge Racer and Tekken may well be about as good as it gets? Sure, we can expect some Doom clones, the slightly remodeled beat-em-ups like Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat, but where's the innovation? Where's the gobsmacking next generation software coming from? I'm not convinced that we'll be seeing anything significantly better than what you can get from the Super NES. Well, I think we'll be seeing through the rest of this series that the PlayStation 1 pretty much had us covered in terms of innovation and great games. In fact, there was the introduction of Net Yaroze, which allowed hobbyist developers to release their games on the demo discs that were contained in these very magazines. And speaking of those iconic demos, I will in fact be covering them in their own separate videos. So just think, by the end of this series, we'll be utterly drowning in nostalgia. I've been Jake of theretroperspective.com. Cheers for watching, hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.